The lantern swings in Sadie's hand as she descends the hidden stairs, her breath caught somewhere between wonder and disbelief. Behind her, Jonah presses his palm flat against the earthen wall, steadying himself. Neither speaks. Below them, a passage stretches into darkness, and beyond it, if they only knew, lay everything her father had ever quietly hoped she would find. Red Willow, Nebraska, October 1891. The wagon creaks down Birch Street on a gray Tuesday morning, and old Hester Mack watches from her porch as the young couple pulls up to the weathered cabin at the lane's end. She calls across to her neighbor. That place has never given anyone a good start. Jonah Pike tips his hat and says nothing. Beside him, Sadie Rowan, soon to be Sadie Pike, watches the cabin and thinks, "We'll see." They had been married 11 days. The ceremony was modest, a parlor affair at Sadie's aunt's house in McCook, with a borrowed dress and a cake that leaned slightly to the left. Jonah had saved for 2 years as a freight hauler for Dietrich and Sons, and Sadie had put aside every spare cent she earned, taking in mending and pressing for the better-off families along Cottonwood Road. Between them, they had scraped together enough for a modest start. But modest was proving difficult to find. They had looked at 4 properties. The first was a sod house 9 miles out of town, cold, cramped, and smelling of something they couldn't identify. The second was a half-finished frame house whose owner wanted twice what it was worth. The third had a collapsed well. By the fourth, which was simply a lot with nothing on it at all, Sadie had quietly stopped making lists. Then the cabin on Birch Street came available. It had belonged, she knew, to her grandfather, Emmett Rowan, a man she remembered only as a tall shadow with rough hands who had lost the property years ago to debt, before she was old enough to understand what debt meant. The bank had held it since, and the bank wanted it gone. The price was low. Suspiciously low, even Jonah said. But it had walls. It had a roof that looked like it meant to stay. It had a front window that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the bare floorboards glow amber for about 20 minutes each day, and Sadie had stood in that light during the walk-through and thought, I could live here. So they bought it. The first week was full of small corrections, a sticking door, a cracked pane replaced with oiled cloth until they could afford glass, a gap beneath the kitchen baseboard stuffed with rags. Jonah fixed what he could with the tools he carried. Sadie scrubbed every surface twice. Slowly, the cabin began to smell like them rather than abandonment. On the 8th day, she found the wardrobe. It stood in the back room, a wide built-in affair of pine boards, its door fitted poorly, its shelves bare except for 2 rusted coat hooks and a scattering of mouse droppings. Sadie was cleaning it out when her broom handle struck the back panel at an odd angle, and the whole rear wall shifted inward with a low, reluctant groan. She stopped. She tapped the panel again. It swung on a pair of hinges she hadn't seen, revealing darkness and the faint smell of cool earth and something dry and cedar-like beneath. Sadie stood very still for a moment. Then she put down her broom, went to the front room, where Jonah was repacking the stovepipe joint with clay, and said, with careful calmness, I think you need to come see something. He came. He looked. He said nothing for a long moment. The opening behind the wardrobe panel was low, 4 feet, perhaps, and beyond it, visible only by the thin spill of light from the room, were the tops of descending wooden stairs. Not cellar stairs, rough-cut and steep. These were carefully built, mortised risers, a fitted handrail on the left side, worn smooth by use. That's deliberate, Jonah said at last. Someone built this, Sadie agreed, and meant it to be found, or meant it not to be. Jonah crouched, studied the framing around the opening. Dry, he said. No rot in the wood. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. He looked up at her. When did your grandfather own this place? He lost it in 81, maybe 82. I was very small. That's 10 years of whatever's down there staying put. They debated it the way practical people debate unfamiliar things, carefully, circling it, looking for reasons not to proceed. Jonah's concern was structural. A hidden passage beneath a property meant unknown excavation, possibly compromised footing. He didn't want to step through a floor into someone else's mistake. Sadie's hesitation was quieter. The wardrobe had been her grandfather's. Whatever lay below had been left during his time. There was something that felt like trespass in following it without understanding why it had been sealed. It's our property now, Jonah said gently when she gave this voice. I know. She touched the smooth edge of the handrail through the opening. That doesn't entirely settle it. They talked about it through supper, a simple meal of cornbread and beans that Sadie barely tasted. Jonah argued that ignorance of what lay beneath their own floor was the greater risk. Sadie agreed, but wanted a night to sit with it, to think about what her grandfather had built and whether the act of finding it obligated her to something she couldn't yet name. She lay awake past midnight, listening to the prairie wind press against the cabin walls, and thought about her father, gone 6 years now, and whether he had ever stood in this room. By morning, she had her answer. She had the lantern lit before Jonah woke. When he came to the kitchen and found her crouched by the wardrobe opening with the light burning and her hair already pinned back, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. You decided, he said. I decided. He pulled on his boots without another word, took the lantern from her so she could manage the low frame, and ducked through the opening first. She followed. The stairs descended into clean, cool darkness, and as the light spread downward and the passage opened before them, Jonah reached back without looking, and Sadie took his hand. They went down together. The cellar was small, 4 walls of fitted stone, shelves along 2 sides, a compacted earth floor swept clean. Jonah moved the lantern in a slow arc. On the shelves, sealed crocks, a row of wax-topped preserving jars, folded burlap, coils of good rope. In the corner, a wooden trunk, latched but not locked. Sadie went to the trunk. Inside, beneath a folded piece of canvas, she found a letter. The handwriting was careful and unhurried. She recognized it before she read a word. It was her father's hand. She did not read it yet. She held it against her coat and looked around the cellar again. Really looked this time, with attention rather than wonder. The crocks were stoppered with wax and fitted lids. The jars were dark glass, the sealed contents visible as a dim solidity. The burlap was folded in even squares, the kind of folding that said habit rather than tidiness. The rope was hemp, well-oiled, looped without tangles. Someone maintained this, she said. Jonah was examining the far wall, pressing his palm against the stone. There's a door here. He worked his fingers along a seam nearly invisible in the fitted surface. A latch, set flush. He pressed it, and the stone-faced panel swung inward. Not stone at all, she realized, but timber-faced with flat rock, hinged on iron. Cool air moved through the opening. Beyond it was a passage. It ran level for perhaps 30 feet, timber-braced at regular intervals, the floor packed and smooth. At the far end, faint light, not lantern light, but the pale gray of an overcast October morning filtering from above. Jonah held the lantern forward. The passage was dry. No water staining on the walls, no heaving in the floor. Built by someone who understood drainage and timber framing and had done neither in a hurry. They walked it in silence, Sadie's free hand trailing the wall. The end of the passage opened through a low timber frame into what appeared to be a root cellar, a proper one, deep dug with ventilation gaps near the ceiling where the gray light entered. Shelves here too, stone-floored, orderly. A second trunk, smaller than the first. A workbench against one wall with tools hanging above it in outlines drawn in faded paint. Each tool in its place, each outline showing exactly where it belonged. Jonah lifted a hand planer from its peg, set it back. These are quality tools, not a working man's cast-offs. He looked at the outlines. Someone knew what these were worth. They found the ladder on the far side of the root cellar, fixed timber rungs set into the wall, ascending to a hatch. Jonah went first, pressed the hatch, and it opened upward with a sound like something long-held exhaling. He climbed through. Sadie followed. She stood up into October air and stopped entirely. She had known in an abstract way that the passage had traveled away from the cabin. She had tracked their direction as they walked, more or less south, she thought, curving slightly west. What she had not imagined was how far they had come, or what they had come to. They were standing in a shallow depression in the land. Natural in origin, she thought, a gentle bowl in the prairie where the ground had settled lower than the surrounding plain. The town's edge was visible to the north, Birch Street's rooflines just cresting the rise, but here, in the bowl, sheltered by that rise on one side and a long curve of old cottonwoods on the other, lay a homestead. Not a ruin, not a forgotten skeleton. A homestead, a tidy frame structure, small but stoutly built, weather-boarded and fitted with a proper door and 2 windows. Beside it, a stone-bordered garden plot, the season's growth long finished, but the soil dark and turned, not packed and weedy, but tended. 6 fruit trees, she would count them later, apple and plum, their trunks whitewashed at the base, their forms shaped by regular pruning. A rain barrel at the building's corner, lidded. A woodpile, stacked under a lean-to, cut to length and covered with oilcloth against the weather. Sadie turned a full, slow circle. The cottonwoods made a sound, like a long, slow breath. The sky was pale and wide. The homestead sat in its bowl as though it had always been there, patient and complete, waiting without urgency. Jonah stood beside her. He did not speak for a long time. "Sadie," he finally said. "I know," she answered. She read the letter sitting on the step of the small frame building, the hatch propped open behind them and the October wind moving through the cottonwoods overhead. "Sadie, if you are reading this, you found the wardrobe, which means you found the stairs, which means you found the passage, and you have been patient enough and curious enough to follow it all the way through. I am glad. I was not certain you would be, though I hoped. The cabin on Birch Street was your grandfather Emmett's, as you know. When he lost it, I could not save it. I was not in a position then to help him or to purchase it back. But I kept watch on it over the years, and when I understood that it would remain available, held by the bank with little interest from buyers, I made arrangements. The land you are standing on is not the cabin's deed. It is a separate claim, filed under a different name, mine, and drawn along lines that have no formal connection to the Birch Street property. I did this carefully. The passage connecting them is known to no one but the man who helped me dig it, and he has since moved to Colorado. What I built here, I built over 11 years. It was my intention to give it to the daughter patient enough to find it. I believe you are that daughter, or it would not be you reading this. Use it well. The soil in the garden is good. I have amended it carefully. The trees bear reliably. The plums are better than they look, The building is tight, and the roof is cedar shake, doubled. The tools in the root cellar are serviceable and well kept. The preserves in the small cellar are from the last 2 seasons and should be sound. One more thing. At the base of the 3rd apple tree from the south, under the flat stone with the straight edge, there is a tin. Open it when you are ready. I loved you before you knew you needed anything. That has not changed. Your father Sadie folded the letter along its original creases. She did not trust her voice quite yet. Jonah waited. He was a man who understood when to wait, which was one of the things she had known about him early and banked on ever since. After a while, she handed him the letter. He read it slowly, the way he read everything, carefully, giving each sentence its proper weight. When he finished, he folded it back, returned it to her, and looked out at the 6 trees. 3rd from the south, he said. She almost laughed. It came out as something close to it. Yes. They found the flat stone easily. It had a clean, manufactured edge that didn't match the prairie rubble around it. Jonah lifted it and set it aside. Beneath it, a tin cylinder, sealed with a wax ring. He handed it to Sadie, and she worked the lid open with her thumbnail. Inside, a folded paper, legal-sized, creased with age, and beneath it, a small cloth bag tied with twine. The paper was a deed. The land claim, some 18 acres she would determine later, filed in her father's name and drawn with a surveyor's precision. At the bottom, an addendum in her father's hand, to be transferred to Sadie Rowan upon date of marriage or upon her lawful claim to the cabin at Birch Street, whichever comes first. The cloth bag held $32 in coin. Not a fortune, but a season's breathing room, and her father had known exactly what a season's breathing room meant. Jonah looked at the deed a long while. Then he looked up at the homestead, the garden, the trees, the small, stout building, and then at his wife. Sadie was looking at the trees. He planted these, she said quietly. He pruned them, every year, alone. He was waiting for you to be ready, Jonah said. She nodded. She thought she had been ready for a long time. She thought, now, that perhaps her father had known exactly how ready she was. They spent the rest of that day in the bowl. Jonah walked the perimeter of the claim, measuring in strides, reading the drainage and the soil. Sadie opened the frame building. 1 room, clean, a small iron stove in the corner, a folded wool blanket on the shelf as if someone had only just stepped out. She stood in the middle of the floor and breathed. That evening, returning through the passage with the lantern, Jonah said, "We could work this." "I know we could," Sadie said. "I mean properly. Not a kitchen garden, a working claim." She looked at him in the lantern light. "So do I." The complications arrived the following week, as complications tend to. The first was practical. The deed, though properly filed and signed, was in her father's name, Howard Rowan, deceased. Transferring it to Sadie, now Pike, required a visit to the county clerk's office in Indianola, a half-day's wagon ride, and the assistance of someone who understood land transfer law well enough to navigate the paperwork. Jonah knew a man, August Fenner, a retired surveyor who did occasional title work out of his home on the east edge of Red Willow. They called on him that Thursday. Fenner was a wiry, precise man of about 60, with spectacles he removed and replaced constantly while he thought. He read the deed twice, studied the addendum, read it again, and set it on his table. "This is proper," he said. "The survey marks are registered. The addendum is witnessed. See here, 2 signatures." He tapped the bottom of the document. "Who are these?" Sadie looked. One signature she didn't recognize. The other made her stop. M. Gottschalk. She knew that name. Old Martin Gottschalk, who had run the dry goods store on 2nd Street until he retired 4 years ago. He was still alive, still in town. "I know one of them," she said. Fenner nodded. "A living witness simplifies things considerably. Bring me a written confirmation from him, and I can process this transfer within the week." He paused. "There is one complication." They waited. "The land butts against the Halverson parcel on the west side. Here." He pointed to the survey lines on the deed. "Rolf Halverson filed an encroachment claim on that boundary 2 years ago, arguing the survey line had been drawn incorrectly. The claim was dismissed, but it's sitting on the record. Anyone with cause to examine the property closely might find it and choose to revisit it." Jonah asked who might have such cause. Fenner replaced his spectacles. "Anyone who learns the property has recently changed hands and has an interest in that western boundary." The second complication arrived before they could resolve the first. On Friday afternoon, a man came to the Birch Street cabin. Sadie answered the door. He was well dressed for Red Willow, a wool town coat, a good hat, boots that had been resoled recently and deliberately. He introduced himself as Mr. Croft, a land agent from Indianola, and said he represented a client interested in acquiring parcels on the southern edge of town. He asked, pleasantly, whether the property at this address included any associated land claims. Sadie told him, pleasantly, that she and her husband had only recently acquired the cabin itself and were still becoming familiar with its particulars. Croft accepted this with a nod and a business card and said he hoped she would keep his client in mind should anything develop. After she closed the door, she stood in the front room for a moment. Then she went to find Jonah, who was mending the fence along the back of the lot. "Someone is already asking," she said, and told him about Croft. Jonah straightened. "How did he know?" "He may not know anything specific. He may be asking everyone on this end of town. Or someone saw us come back through the field." They had been careful, entering and leaving the hidden homestead through the hatch only in early morning or at dusk, avoiding the open rise. But care was not invisibility. Red Willow was a small town. People noticed patterns without knowing what the patterns meant. They needed to move faster than they had planned. Martin Gottschalk remembered everything. He received them in his front parlor on Saturday morning, a compact, deliberate man of 72 with a tobacco-yellowed mustache and eyes that still held the sharp appraisal of a man who had spent 40 years judging whether customers would pay their accounts. He recognized Sadie at once. "Howard Rowan's daughter," he said, before she introduced herself. "You have his forehead." She told him why they had come. She showed him the deed. He studied his own signature for a long moment without expression, then set the document on his knee. "I witnessed that in the spring of '89, he said. "Your father came to me specifically because I'd known Emmett Rowan and understood the background. He wanted someone who would remember, if it came to it." He looked at Sadie. "He said he had made something for you. He didn't say what." "Did he say why he hadn't simply told me?" Sadie asked. Gottschalk was quiet for a moment. "He said he wanted it to be a discovery, not a gift. He said there was a difference." Sadie thought about that. Gottschalk wrote out a confirmation letter in a careful hand, signed it, and added his former business address as context for the county record. He also, unprompted, provided the name of the second witness, a woman named Pearl Ankerst, who had worked at the county records office and was now living in Curtis. "She'll confirm it in writing if you write to her," he said. "She's that kind of person." They thanked him. He held the deed out to Jonah as they stood to go, then seemed to reconsider and turned and gave it to Sadie instead. "It was meant for you," he said simply. The Halverson boundary issue proved more tangled. Rolf Halverson was not a difficult man by nature, Jonah determined after asking quietly around town. He was a farmer of moderate means and moderate temperament who had filed the encroachment claim 2 years ago, not out of aggression, but because his eldest son, Peter, had convinced him the boundary was wrong and that he was owed additional footage along the western edge. The claim had been dismissed because Peter's measurements were incorrect. But Peter was still of the same opinion. Jonah called on the Halverson farm on Sunday. He brought the original survey document, which Fenner had helped him locate at the county office, filed by a professional surveyor in 1887 and marked with the iron pins that Jonah had already located in the field. He spread the survey on Halverson's kitchen table and walked through it plainly, without accusation. Here are the registered pins. Here is the line. Here is the measurement. Rolf Halverson studied it for a long time. Peter, standing at the doorway, studied Jonah. "The line is what it is," Jonah said. "I'm not looking for an argument. I'm looking for a settled boundary, because I intend to work this land and I'd rather have a neighbor than a dispute." Rolf Halverson asked 2 questions. Jonah answered them honestly. Then Halverson nodded, folded the survey back along its original lines, and returned it. "Peter measured wrong," he said, without looking at his son. "The line stands." Jonah thanked him, shook hands, and left. As for Croft, the land agent did not return. Whether his unnamed client lost interest or simply found other parcels to pursue, they never knew. His business card sat on the windowsill for a month and was eventually used to prop up a loose window latch. The deed transferred on Wednesday in Sadie's name. The transfer receipt was in her hand when the county clerk added, almost as an afterthought, that a second inquiry about the property had been made that morning. Not by Croft, but by a representative of the Platte River Land Consolidation Company, out of Lincoln. Sadie asked what they had wanted to know. The clerk checked his notes. Whether any associated agricultural claims were attached to the Birch Street parcel. I told them I had no information on that. She walked to the wagon where Jonah was waiting. "We may have moved fast enough," she said. "Or we may have drawn attention by moving fast," Jonah said. Neither of them spoke on the ride home. She sat up late that night with the letter in her lap. The fire had burned low. Jonah was asleep. He had an early haul the next morning, a freight run to Oxford that he couldn't afford to miss. She had told him to rest and that she would think. And this was a fair division, because thinking quietly in the dark was something she had always done better alone. She read the letter again. "I believe you are that daughter, or it would not be you reading this." She had taken that sentence as comfort when she first read it. Now she read it differently. Her father had built this across 11 years. He had planned it through illness. She knew now, from Gottschalk, that Howard Rowan had been aware by 88 that his health would not hold. He had filed the deed that year, witnessed by 2 careful people. He had kept working the land alone, pruning in the autumn, turning the garden soil each spring, stacking wood each summer, for years that he must have suspected he would never see completed. He had done all of it on the wager that she would be patient enough to find it. And now a company from Lincoln, whose name meant organized money rather than individual want, was asking questions. She could not let what he had built become someone else's calculation. By morning, she knew what to do. She wrote 2 letters before Jonah came home. The first was to Pearl Ankhurst in Curtis, asking for written confirmation of her witness to the deed, and asking, further, whether she still had her copy of the filing register from 1889, which would show the official receipt date. The second was to August Fenner, asking whether the land claim could be additionally secured by immediate cultivation, by an act of working use that would establish not just title but occupancy. Fenner's reply came back the next afternoon. Yes. Get something in the ground. They dug on Saturday, not the full garden. The season was wrong for that, October turning cold, the first real frosts already dusting the grass by morning. But Jonah had spoken, during the week, with a man at the feed store who overwintered garlic each year and swore by it. You planted it in the fall, he said, and it came up reliable in the spring, and there was no crop that said I am working this land more plainly than one that had been put in the earth with intention and left to take root through winter. They bought 36 bulbs. They planted them in rows in the dark garden soil of the hidden homestead, Sadie setting each clove with the point upward while Jonah worked the row ahead with a narrow hoe. The cottonwoods had gone gold now, and the leaves came down in slow, unhurried drifts around them while they worked. The October sun was low and bright, and it lay across the garden and the 6 fruit trees and the stout little building in a way that made everything look considered, composed, as if the land itself had been waiting to be seen in this particular light. Pearl Ankerst's letter arrived the following Tuesday. It was thorough and precise. She had kept her copy of the register as Fenner had hoped, and the 1889 entry was intact, showing the filing date, her signature as witness, and the county receipt mark. She included an affidavit, properly sworn before a justice of the peace in Curtis, confirming every detail. She also wrote, at the bottom, in a looser hand than the rest, Your father asked me once if I thought a person could build a future for someone who didn't know they needed it yet. I told him I thought that was exactly the kind of building that lasted. Sadie read this part twice and then put the letter with the deed in the trunk. Fenner brought the completed documentation to the county clerk himself. He had, he told them afterward, over coffee at the cabin table, taken the liberty of noting in the accompanying letter that the parcel was under active cultivation. He had observed it personally, which was technically true, as Jonah had shown him the garden and the garlic rows the previous Saturday, and he had inspected them with the professional care of a retired surveyor who believed that what you noted on a record had to be what you had seen with your eyes. The Platte River Land Consolidation Company's representative did not return. They learned later, through the particular information keeping of a small town, that the company had been inquiring broadly along the southern parcels, not specifically targeting the Rowan claim, but consolidating land for a proposed rail spur that had ultimately been routed north and made the southern parcels irrelevant. The inquiry had been circumstantial. The timing had simply been uncomfortable. Jonah received this news with the equanimity of a man who had done what needed doing regardless of the reason. Sadie received it with something quieter, a kind of retroactive gratitude for the urgency, because without it they might not have planted the garlic, and without the garlic she might not have stood in the garden that Saturday afternoon and understood, in her body rather than just her mind, that this was hers, that she had worked it, that the act of kneeling in her father's soil and putting something in it with her own hands had completed something she hadn't known was incomplete. November came and hardened the ground. They spent their evenings making plans, proper ones now, with the deed secure and the documentation recorded and the boundary settled. In the spring, they would expand the garden. The fruit trees would be pruned in February. Gottschalk had told her a man in town could show her how, and she had already made an arrangement. The frame building on the hidden homestead would need its stovepipe inspected before they used it as a workroom, but Jonah had looked at it and said the structure itself was sound. Her father had built well. Some evenings they sat at the table and added up what they had: the cabin, the passage, the 18 acres, the tools, the fruit trees, the preserved stores that had turned out to be entirely sound, the $32 that they had put toward a new pane of glass for the window, and a good stock of seed for spring, and still had $12 remaining. Not wealth, but ground, but tools and seed and a roof that meant to stay, and an 18-acre claim under their name that had been built across 11 years by a man who had decided, quietly and without announcement, that the future he could not give his daughter directly, he would bury for her to find. One evening in late November, Jonah came in from feeding the horse to find Sadie standing at the front window in the amber light. He stopped in the doorway. "What are you looking at?" he asked. She considered. "I'm trying to decide whether I would have found it," she said, "if we hadn't bought the cabin, if we'd taken the sod house instead or waited for something else." Jonah hung his coat and came to stand beside her. "You'd have found something," he said. She thought about that, about her father's letter, about the difference between a discovery and a gift, and whether her father had understood, when he drew that line, that the finding was the gift, that the patience required to follow a thing all the way through was itself what he had wanted for her. She thought he had known exactly. She leaned against her husband in the amber light, and was glad, in a way she had no better word for, that the wardrobe had been built in rather than freestanding. In February, they pruned the apple trees together. The man from town had come out the first morning and shown them how, the angle of the cut, which branches to spare, how to read the shape a tree was reaching for and help it get there. By the second morning, Jonah and Sadie worked side by side without instruction. The bowl was quiet in the winter light. The cottonwoods stood bare and patient. The garlic was underground, pressing upward in the dark, unhurried. Sadie made the last cut on the last tree and stepped back to look. The tree looked like something that intended to bear fruit. She thought her father would have approved.